We have like 800,000 subscribers on our channel. We're like gigantic on YouTube, and we cannot get anybody on the phone like when we have an issue, and so in a weird way, this is another thing that I worry about is that, as kind of new eras settle into, the equivalent of middle age or something, you see this resurgence of bureaucracy, and that is troubling to me. And I think that's one of the things that some younger people, I think millennials and Zoomers on a certain level, they were raised, particularly millennials, to believe in the system.
Hi, I'm Jim O'Shaughnessy, and welcome to Infinite Loops. Sometimes we get caught up in what feel like infinite loops when trying to figure things out. Markets go up and down, research is presented and then refuted, and we find ourselves right back where we started. The goal of this podcast is to learn how we can reset our thinking on issues that hopefully leaves us with a better understanding as to why we think the way we think and how we might be able to change that to avoid going in infinite loops of thought. We hope to offer our listeners a fresh perspective on a variety of issues and look at them through a multifaceted lens, including history, philosophy, art, science, linguistics, and yes, also through quantitative analysis. And through these discussions, help you not only become a better investor, but also become a more nuanced thinker. With each episode, we hope to bring you along with us as we learn together. Thanks for joining us. Now please enjoy this episode of Infinite Loops.
Jim O'Shaughnessy is Chairman and Co-Chief Investment Officer of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management, where Jamie Catherwood is an associate. All opinions expressed by Jim, Jamie, and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinions of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. Clients of O'Shaughnessy Asset Management may maintain positions in the securities discussed in this podcast.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops, and I am super excited with today's guest, Nick Gillespie, who is the host of The Reason Interview, has been a journalist forever. I've been reading him forever, and basically, we share a credo, which is free minds, free markets. We're going to get into that in a minute. But what Nick has that I'm very rarely envious of anything, but I am envious of this quote that he has on him. And it is this: Nick Gillespie is to libertarianism what Lou Reed is to rock and roll, the quintessence of the outlaw spirit. And that was written, folks, in the New York Times Magazine. Wow. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I thought you were going to say Nick Gillespie is to libertarianism what Lou Reed is to rock and roll. Dead, But
well, that Nick, that's funny because that's my first question.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, I was kind of, very, very seriously anti-authoritarian to the point where I would do things that were against my own better interests just to show that I was not going to follow orders. Right. And so libertarianism was very, very appealing to me. And like kind of my first question to you as sort of the grand master here, is libertarianism?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that in a complicated way because, why use a few words when many will do, but also because it is a kind of complex question. What I would say is libertarianism isn't dead, but it's resting its eyes, at least as a political phenomenon and to some degree as a cultural phenomenon. And one of the things that, we're of the same vintage, late 50s, early 60s, the golden years, right? The peak years. And I've always believed that politics is secondary to culture. Matt Welch and I, my colleague at Reason, we wrote a book a decade ago called The Declaration of Independence with E and TS. And we talk about how politics is a lagging indicator of where America is or where society is. And I worry that libertarianism, which is, a credo of, and it's good that you said anti-authoritarian, because I think libertarianism properly understood is not anti-authority, but it is anti-authoritarian. And, this is one of the major cleavages of our time, authoritarian versus libertarian. And the idea is that libertarians believe that in free minds and free markets, free speech, free everything, as long as it's peaceful, but it's rooted in individuals having more meaningful choices in their lives that they can actually access and do, as opposed to authoritarian, which is always trying to narrow the limits of what is acceptable, whether it's through kind of cultural coercion or political coercion. Having said all of this as a kind of throat clearing and everything, it's clear that libertarianism for a good chunk of the 90s, as the internet came online, and it's also, I started working at Reason in the fall of 1993, and the 90s turned out to be a fantastic decade for libertarian with a small L kind of thought. I use libertarian as an adjective. It's a descriptor. It's a pre-sentiment. It's certainly pre-partisan. It's pre-political. It's a default setting. Do you think, in any given instance, should people have more choices, more freedom or less freedom? And my default setting is more freedom. Sometimes that gets overruled. And in the 90s, the internet kind of incarnated what the modern libertarian movement, since World War II, post-war America was moving towards decentralized knowledge, not the end of gatekeepers, but the deregulation of gatekeeping, so that, for me, I wrote a story 20 plus years ago where I was talking about cultural deregulation. And, when you have that, when Disney is no longer ABC, CBS, NBC are not the only game in town, you don't get fewer gatekeepers, you get more gatekeepers. It's like religion. There was, for me, the 17th century in England when they had a civil war, between the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. It's really kind of like the hippie, it's Eric Clapton versus the Sex Pistols. It's Roundheads versus Cavaliers. It's punks versus hippies. But, in the 17th century, people were afraid if you got rid of the Church of England, if you disestablished it, religion would go away. And in fact, what you get is more religion than ever. And that's what we've seen in America. When you get rid of cultural gatekeeping, political gatekeeping, economic gatekeeping, you get more sects, you get more cults, you get more, communities that flourish. Some die, some don't, others recombine, and all of that kind of stuff. So again, I'm like front loading a lot of stuff. I think in the 90s, there was a lot of libertarianism was ascendant. And, and you saw coming out of Silicon Valley, everybody, whether their political commitments might be Democratic or Republican, but they were all small L libertarian. After 9/11, there was a spasm of repression and I think of authoritarianism in American culture and politics, but the libertarian thread kept pushing through. And I think, I was editor of the print magazine from 2000 to 2008, and then I took over the website and I launched our video platform. And, up through from about 2000 to about 2015, I think there was a strong push for libertarian ideas, especially in the Republican Party, but also in the Democratic Party and in the culture more broadly. People were starting to get more comfortable with the idea that it's good to have people have more choices, and nobody's ever fully comfortable with that because you and I will make good choices, but those people over there, we can't really trust them. But then, in a lot of ways, it came to a skidding halt when Trump landed, from at the bottom of the escalator. People like Rand Paul and before him, his father, Ron Paul, and I have issues with the way they define libertarianism, but that was a moment where it looked like the Republican Party was going to go explicitly libertarian. They were going to finally say, we don't want to spend as much money. We don't want to control as much of the economy or of your private lives. And, that is not the world we live in now. And it's not simply Trump because, when you look at somebody like Joe Biden or, Barack Obama, like that, they were good government types. They are a return, and in his own way, Trump was too, to a kind of best and brightest mentality of the mid 20th century, which was kind of the high watermark of the authoritarian impulse, I would say, where you have a few wise men, usually men, now more, it might be women and men, but, who get to call the shots. And, for me, and again, we're the same age, I think. And I was born in New York and Brooklyn. In 63, I grew up in New Jersey. My parents were lower middle class. They they came of age. They were born in the 20s. They came of age in the American century where they believed, people like John Kenneth Galbraith and, in Franklin Roosevelt and, the Kennedy, kind of the best and the brightest type of stuff. We come on the other side of that and we realize, God, the last thing you would want to do is work for AT&T or IBM or, companies that don't really exist in the way that they used to, thank God. I can remember, I have an older brother who was born in 59 and he graduated college in 1981. And my parents' advice, and my father didn't even graduate high school. So it's amazing, that their kid graduates college and they're like, get a job with the biggest corporation you can find. Get a job at AT&T or at IBM or at Xerox, Kodak. They would list off these companies that by the time I graduated college in 1985, they didn't even really exist anymore. And that's the shift, right? And it's a great shift. But I fear, people are trying to claw back on both the right and the left. The right wants to control many aspects of our private lives, but also the economy. They hate capitalism because capitalism will give you what you want. And they don't want you to want certain things. And then the left, it's got its hangups and it's just as bad. And they intersect oftentimes on foreign policy where, they want to control the world because they know better. And so I'm worried about the current moment. There's a roundabout way of saying libertarianism is alive, but it is kind of dormant as a political kind of force right now. I think it can come back from that slumber at any moment. But over the past 50 years, over the past 30 years, when I have a list that I wrote here, for interviews of, not of communists in the State Department, but of big libertarian wins, and this is in the past 50 years. Reason was founded in 1968. So I like to benchmark stuff against that. Freedom of speech, the 7 dirty words, it's so much better now. Deregulation of all cultural markets. You can get whatever you want, whenever you want. That's a combination of technology and of changes in attitudes and mindset, equality, lifestyle liberation more broadly. People are anti-war finally in America. Politicians are not, but the people are. Gun rights have been expanding since the 1990s. Drug legalization, not simply of things to get high, but we now believe in a world where you should have the choice to change the way that you feel with legal and illegal drugs, and more drugs should be legal. Technology allows us for, different types of living arrangements, no more organization man, no more showing up at, punching it at 9, et cetera. There's so many big wins. Sexual freedom, licensing reform is taking place, criminal justice reform. So over the past 50 years, libertarians have won massive, significant political and cultural battles, but they don't get credit for it. And right now, neither of the major parties is providing a microphone for libertarian ideas. So I'm definitely worried about that. And in that sense, that's the current moment of libertarianism compared to, 6-10 years ago. It's problematic.
Yeah. Well, a ton to unpack there because I agree with you on so many of those points. I just sort of gave up on politics because it just seemed to me that this emotional mind virus, aided and abetted by social media, just created these, the in-tribe, the out-group, and basically, literally, they were just screaming talking points at each other. Yeah. And so I looked to have, however tiny an influence I could have, much more on culture and society, because I agree with you that culture and society lead politics. They don't follow politics. And one of your list is a perfect list. What I find really interesting is that I will often talk to people of a variety of ages. And I had an experience a while back where I was talking to an extremely well-known author, and she claimed to be, a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat progressive. And I started asking her a series of questions, libertarian style questions. Do you favor more freedom or less freedom? And literally, she answered more freedom to every one of my questions. And I looked at her and I said, "You're not a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. You're a libertarian." And she was shocked.
Oh, yeah.
And so one of the problems that, from my way of looking at things, we are so laden with labels, and labels are lazy aggregations of ideas under a term, and people tend to be label thinkers. And so try to kind of chip away at that is, I think, worthwhile, because, you know, the way I look at it is much like you. I am, and try to remain as apolitical in terms of discussion, because they're not discussions. They're shouting matches. And I believe that many people on both sides, so let's be very clear here. I think both sides of the aisle in politics, we have the worst political class in American history. And that is saying something. That is saying something.
Yeah.
Because if you know U.S. history, that is a bold statement. But this idea of all of this emotional energy being put into shouting talking points at one another, it just seems to me to be such a waste of not only time, but of energy, mental space, the whole deal. And what also really bothers me, and you touched on it, they have made politics sacred. And as you know, the sacred cannot be challenged.
Right.
If you challenge it, you're a heretic, you're an apostate. And I happily wear both of those labels. And luckily, we're still not burning people at the stake or hanging them. But, you know, one of the next things that I want to get your read on is, I think I am by my nature a very optimistic, in a rational, optimistic way, right? For what's going on and what's coming. I believe, like, holy shit, the internet is the greatest amplifier in human history. The tools that are now available again for the individual to make use of these tools. I got sent some movies that were made exclusively using the new iPhone and a Mac, and they blew me away. I was like, holy fuck. And so I find that amazing and really energizing on my part. But do you think, is there any way, is there a way to have conversations? And, you know, we met at an in person, and Anna Gatt is a friend of mine. I'm an investor in that company. I think that's cool. But like, it just seems to me, when I do a lot of coaching too, and it's mostly of millennials, and one of the first things that I hear from them is like, they're afraid to say what they actually think.
Yeah.
You run into that?
Yeah, I have two sons, a 28-year-old and a 21-year-old. That said, they're technically, one's a millennial and one's a Generation Z or a Zoomer. And, you know, to a certain degree, you know, they're both boys. They're white. They were raised upper middle class. You know, they have highly educated parents, you know, and they're kind of the villains of contemporary American discourse. Possibly the only group that is more demonized just out of the box are white women of a similar kind of class. And yeah, they're a little bit anxious about, you know, what you say, because everything is supercharged. I take some of that with a grain of salt too, because it's also like, well, you know, it's never easy to kind of say what you think and what you believe, especially if you're a little bit out of step with maybe, you know, what you think everybody else is thinking. So, you know, you got to kind of be brave and, you know, and be human. But I think there's a lot of that. And I think part of the problem, you know, to go to your optimism and your rational optimism, you know, Matt Ridley is a guy who's written for Reason and, you know, wrote a book called The Rational Optimist. I think one of the things that we have the benefit of is having a sense of history, you know, partly because we lived through it. And I still have probably 20 or 30% of my brain is functioning. And, you know, and I can look everything up on Wikipedia. But, you know, millennials and Zoomers don't have, I mean, this to me is one of the ironies of technology, and it's worth kind of thinking through and fixing. But, you know, now for the first time in human history, you know, fuck the Library of Alexandria, like you have everything that has been thought and written and, you know, made into music and made into video or movies or whatever, all artwork, it's all at our fingertips, and we're super presentists. All we care about is what happened in the last 5 minutes and what's going to happen in the next 10. And, if you look at history, it's just like, God, things are getting so much better for so many people. In America, sometimes I think part of our problem is that and I think Trump intuited this, but he didn't know what to do with it. But we may be in a situation where it's similar or analogous to France and England after World War II, where no longer, really world powers, but kind of, we're being displaced. The U.S. is being displaced, not by communist China or anything, but just by a multipolar world where there's more opportunity. And certainly outside of Europe or the OECD countries, so Europe and some Asian countries and, in North America, the world is getting so much better so quickly for so many people. And, and yet we're walking around, we're moping around the world is ending and it's beginning in so many ways. And I feel like a lot of millennials and Zoomers, particularly in America and North America and in Europe, feel this like they're living through the end of the world. And it's no, you have, the door is open, go out and you can go anywhere in the world. You can be whatever you want, regardless of where you come from. And they're not getting that. And, part of my goal with kind of the stuff that I write about, and I think what Reason tries to do on some level, is kind of provide a kind of usable past, a history of what does progress mean and how do you get more of it rather than less of it? And, I also think, you said, and I agree with you, labels can be a cheap trick to dismiss people. But sometimes, if you think of it as a brand and brands do accrue a certain amount of information, and the libertarian brand, the small L libertarian brand, which I care a lot about that. It needs to be kind of updated for millennials and Zoomers. I'm a big fan of Friedrich Hayek's work. And, he talked in his terrible, he was writing in English, I guess, but it really, he wrote as if he was writing in, old German and translating it into new German and then, making it even worse when it came out in English. But, at one point he said you have to update the terms of the argument for kind of liberal principles of individualism and of giving people the ability to choose among different ways of living. And I think, it would be helpful if libertarians started talking about empathy and autonomy. This is, along with the idea that it's an adjective. It's not, here are 10 things you must believe all 10, otherwise you are an apostate. You're not a real libertarian. But are you headed in this direction? Do you feel this way about things? And I like to think about it in terms of empathy and autonomy. How do we increase empathy for people that we meet, everybody in our world? And how do we increase autonomy? And, when you start to talk about things in those terms, what are the institutions, both public and private? What are the mindsets? What are the temperaments? What are the psychological structures that kind of do well in that world? And it leads us to this kind of free minds and free market world where it's you're given a lot of options and you're given the tools to make wise choices, where you're thinking about other people, not simply yourself in some kind of narrow utilitarian calculus.
Yeah, I think that I agree completely on focusing on those. And I remember having a conversation with a friend not too long ago and kind of just shaking my head and thinking, I've lived long enough to find that my ideas of freedom of choice. So for the individual specifically, that means you're pro-choice on the question, freedom of drugs. If you're looking at the efficacy of just drug treatment trials that are being done right now, specifically with psychedelics, if you took the name of the drug off and you just looked at the clinical results, all psychedelics and euphorics would be legal.
Right.
Because they're having profound effects. What, by the way, we're of a similar vintage. I didn't grow up believing that. I grew up believing just the opposite. I mean, the propaganda worked on me, at least. It was holy shit, LSD, are you crazy? You're going to jump off a building. And so that gets me back, though, to this idea that the world, they could do that back then, right? So if you know history, you know that, in my opinion, Nixon was potentially the craziest man to ever occupy the Oval Office. We could go back and forth with others, but
sure,
Nixon was batshit crazy.
Yeah.
And he also
incredibly smart. and well read.
Yes.
I mean, it's like, I don't know about you, but like, I didn't start paying attention to politics or politicians in a real way, probably until the very end of the Reagan presidency. But when I go back and I see interviews with Nixon, I'm like, wow, he's a good talker. He knows history, he knows philosophy, he knows political science.
Yeah.
But I agree, he's destroyed by, inner demons and resentment and all sorts of, and really bad ideas, because like he wanted to literally control the economy. I mean, he put wage and price controls. Yeah. And, some of my earliest memories are, gas lines, first, I guess, in the early 70s and then in the later 70s. And because we had a couple cars in New Jersey, I suspect all states did this, but, there was a period which is unimaginable in many ways, but like, where you could only go to the gas station if your license plate ended in an even number today, and then it would be odd. Yep. And like people would swap in, license plates so they could get gas when they needed it. But that, and Nixon has that kind of lunatic control fantasy, which in the end, he hated John F. Kennedy and he hated Robert Kennedy and he hated Ted Kennedy, but he was the same as them. Like he wanted, his control knobs were a little bit different, that'd be twisting, but the whole idea is like, no, now we're going to control stuff. And like, yeah, that's goodbye to all that.
I totally agree. And the point that I'm doing a series called The Great Reshuffle. We'll probably use bits from this interview when we're talking about this particular segment, but it's like, I believe that we are witnessing what I call the Great Reshuffle, which is things are changing dramatically. And I think that they're changing dramatically in favor of like people in emerging countries. For example, this podcast, time, space, geography, they're gone. Yeah. They're absolutely gone. And our hiring practice, proof of work, we don't give a shit about your CV, man.
Yeah.
I don't care if you went to school. I just don't care.
You're a proof of work. So Bitcoin is really the future.
Right? So, I have not, I put Bitcoin, and this might sound like a cop out, but I put Bitcoin in my too hard pile.
Yeah.
I have really tried to understand the use cases. I think personally that Ethereum has a better use case because of all the things that you can accomplish with it. But I'm also a believer in putting skin in the game if you really want to understand something.
Sure.
So I did that. My son has a series of very popular podcasts. And what made him well known was a series he did, I think in 2017 on Bitcoin. Yeah. And so we were sitting at a hotel at a cousin's party. And I said, okay, we got 30 minutes till the bus comes. Tell me what Bitcoin is. Yeah. He did a very good.
Oh, okay. That's great.
Yeah, he did a very good job. And I'm like, so should I pay attention to it? He goes, yeah, you really do need to have to pay attention to it. And so we made an investment, actually, because I didn't have any idea what the fuck I was doing. Yeah. I gave it to a long short crypto fund that went long certain coins, certain protocols, short others, and forgot about it because like in the first month, it lost half its value.
Right. Yeah.
And so then my finance person comes in and says, Jim, you might want to look at that fund again. And it had like 10x.
Oh, yeah.
And just being an old Wall Streeter, I was like, sell right now. But so, I am one of those, we'll see. Like,
yeah. Well, what I meant is when you said, you show me the proof of work, I was because in a way, I mean, I like Bitcoin, if the internet is the most important thing, since the printing press or something, Bitcoin might be the most interesting development that's internet enabled since then. But the idea of proof of work, that we're going to have distributed ledgers where rather than relying simply on people's reputation or, third parties saying, okay, this guy's okay, you went to this university, so I'll hire you. You want us to do what people can do. And I think that's a reshuffling, right? That's a big shift. That's going back to, it's not, I mean, I love college. I love higher education. I learned so much as an undergrad. I went on for a master's degree and I have a PhD in American literature, and I loved it. And it's really helpful and all of that kind of stuff. But it's mostly because of the methodology that I learned and the knowledge that I gained, as well as the kind of perspective. But I love the idea that we're going to a world where it's less important, like who where you come from or who you come from. And, this is just the long enlightenment of getting away from a status society to a society where, people you have a certain amount of freedom and a certain amount of, ability. Now go build your world. This is awesome.
Yeah. And on that point, that is the part of this that excites me, the most in many ways, because essentially, with that collapse of time, space, geography, a billion people just came online. This, like I said, this podcast, everyone except for one guy lives either in Romania, India. We're looking at hiring somebody in Africa. And they would not have these opportunities if it were not for the internet.
Yeah.
So, and I like your connection. By the way, I too think your higher education is awesome.
Yeah.
If you, I never stop learning is my mantra, right? It's just keep going. But then again, here we are again, right? So we have now something like, if you took 1980 Jim, who was 20, and dropped him here, he would be agog that you could, for no money, you could get the best education in the world for free.
Right.
That people 100 years ago, even the richest person 100 years ago, could not have bought at any price.
Right.
As you mentioned, the Library of Alexandria, right? Yeah. And so, there's just so many really great things that are enabling people. Now, on the scary side, of course, there are the Vogons, as I call them. I don't know if if you like Douglas Adams, but
I have largely steered clear of Douglas Adams.
So if I was going to give you a tip, is if you read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, read it thinking that he is a philosopher as opposed to a sci-fi humorist.
That makes it more appealing already.
Much more appealing. And so the Vogons are the galaxy's or universe's ultimate bureaucrats.
Right.
And they are that viscosity that just slows those big companies you mentioned at the top down to nothing. And so I think that, back to just to finish the thought on Nixon and why I'm also really psyched about what's coming. So in 1970, one or two, when Nixon declared the war on drugs, made non-addictive psychedelics illegal, and you went to FedMax for those, he could do it.
Yeah.
Because there were two newspapers that mattered, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. There were 3 networks, and that was it, man. Last weekend, I just did a deep dive because Spotify, for some weird reason, created a playlist for me of 1950s crooner songs. And so I'm I wasn't even born then. So I'm listening to them. Oh my God, you should do it. You think we're programmed now? Holy shit, Rosemary Clooney, or I can't remember who's singing the song, but it's a good day to pay your bills.
Wow. Yeah.
What? And then I watch some of the TV shows, and then you start thinking about it. I Love Lucy, 64 million viewers every week.
Yeah.
The closest we've come is 18 million viewers for the finale of Game of Thrones. Right. So in this atomization of culture, it's why you get these subgroups. It's why you get clanning up. That's the downside. But it would be almost impossible now for even a central authority, if we remain a democracy, obviously, to do what Nixon did. It would be impossible, right?
And, one of the knocks on Nixon, which I think is broadly accurate, is that, he completed the regulatory regime of the Great Society. So, it's LBJ passed all of the spending programs and things like that. But then Nixon with, the BATF, the Drug Enforcement Administration, OSHA, it's just the EPA. It's an endless string of alphabet soup regulatory agencies that are bureaucratic in nature. And, I think one of the great, successes of the past 50 years was getting away from bureaucracy, and the internet, especially in its early days, like it liberated us from bureaucracy, and you could actually directly deal with people who mattered. Or the catchphrase in the 90s was disintermediation, right?
Yep.
Where you got rid of intermediaries. I worry now that in many ways, the state, because the state keeps getting bigger, even if it's less able to control things, and even if we're able to kind of find, little pockets of resistance and temporary autonomous zones where we can do what we want, at least for a while. The state continues to grow, and it's bureaucratic in nature, but so are many of the big corporations. What, I guess we can't call them FANG anymore, right? It's MANG for
Mango,
Apple, Netflix, and Google, which I guess is Alphabet. So it's, which is great, right? That's creative destruction. That even, a catchphrase for the big tech companies from a couple of years ago is outdated already, but they are getting more and more bureaucratic. I deal a lot with YouTube because we put out almost a video a day during the work week. And, it is, we have like 800,000 subscribers on our channel. We're like gigantic on YouTube, and we cannot get anybody on the phone like when we have an issue, and so in a weird way, this is another thing that I worry about, is that, as kind of new eras settle into, the equivalent of middle age or something, you see this resurgence of bureaucracy, and that is troubling to me. And I think that's one of the things that some younger people, I think millennials and Zoomers on a certain level, they were raised, particularly millennials, to believe in the system. I have a friend of mine who I went to college with, who taught high school in New Jersey for like 30 years, who retired a couple of years ago. And he said, he started out, he would teach his kids Catch-22, which is, the Joseph Heller novel about it's set in World War II. It came out in the early 60s, and it was a big book of the new left and of the counterculture, both right wing and left wing, actually, because it's about how the system it's not even malicious. It's just, but it's designed to fuck you over. That's, the only people who can get out of military service are insane people. But if you say I'm insane, they know you're faking, so you don't get out. It's like, and he said, like starting about 10 years ago, his students were like, this doesn't make sense. Why doesn't Yossarian, the protagonist, just go to the army and complain about bad treatment? Like they were raised in the sweet spot of where the system was actually responsive to that. And I don't, the system isn't responsive in a long way. And so you want to constantly be narrowing down and whittling down what the system is capable of doing and starting new systems that are smaller and more responsive. And I think in many ways, that's what's been going on in the past 50 years, is that we've been able to get to more responsive systems. But now, again, there's both in the culture as well as in government, I think, there's kind of pushback on that, which is deeply troubling to me.
Yeah, I agree. And, we've always had those, the explorers. And by the way, it's the same with ants peeling off to find new things, 5% of them, bees peeling off, same 5%, termite mounds. I don't know if you've ever been to Africa, but like when you do deep dives on not just human evolution, but the evolution of the planet, it's like there are some very, very strong things in our base code. And one of them is this desire for illusion of control. If you remove an illusion of control from a human being, you can literally make them go crazy.
Right.
But then it makes itself real in these organizations where groupthink has taken over. And like the whole notion of a big company, like I've been an entrepreneur most of my life. I worked briefly for a big company, Bear Stearns, which was the most sort of libertarian, if you will, company, meaning no bureaucracy. If it was legal and you were doing it well, they left you alone. And I had a lot of fun, met a lot of super smart people there, but like literally, there seems to be this trend, like your experience with YouTube. Big companies are desperate not to offend anyone, right? And so they find themselves caught up where other people who might be using really extreme standards say, "Oh no, that's fake news," or that's that's not a valid opinion, or whatever. And like it's just it's very tricky for them because,
there's also a shift to automation, or like early, really bad, kind of like World War I era plastic surgery disasters of artificial intelligence or whatever, so that you get copyright claims or something gets flagged for having bad language. And it turns out, it's a misspelling or it's, devoid of context. And, I go back and forth. I was just reading about the kind of human scale movement of the late 60s and early 70s of, the idea that small is beautiful and, a diet for a small planet, and I toggle back and forth between, I want to live, I live in New York City. I was born here. I worked here after college. I went on a 30-year kind of circuit around the country. And when I was able to, I was like, I want to live in New York because it's so fucking big. It's, everything is here. And then you carve out like little tiny bits, that are I have more solidarity here than I did. I lived on and off for 20 years in a small college town in Ohio, and I have more tight-knit community here. But, you want to be able to toggle between big and small, et cetera. And I think a lot of corporations now are, as they scale, they are like, we got to automate everything. And then that screws things up because you lose the human touch. And so, these are kind of good problems to have, right? I mean, it's like, if your problem is that your video is being, your video, which can now be distributed seamlessly and easily around the world, even in authoritarian countries, because people are using VPNs and everything, and like, you're getting flagged for a copyright infringement or something like that's kind of good, but, it can be better.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I remain incredibly optimistic about what's going to happen. I think we're going into a world where the tools that are available, and especially to digital natives, are just so extraordinary that, I'm probably wrong, but it would not surprise me at all to still be alive when there is a $1 billion corporation with one employee. And like, that's how useful and incredibly the leverage offered by these tools and the amplification offered by the internet is just like amazing. And it's one of the reasons why you see all of the older gatekeepers losing their minds, because they can just go around it. And like, what I love is kind of what I joke about the New York Times Substack railroad, where you have your great, perfect, progressive credentials like Barry Weiss. You go to the New York Times and immediately get fired for saying something, and then you go to Substack and like you're making millions of dollars a year.
Substack is like, it's the outlet that we need, right? At a time when legacy media is becoming more restrictive. Suddenly, this thing like I interviewed Penn Jillette recently of Penn and Teller. He's a big libertarian guy, and he's had some issues with it because of Trump and COVID and whatnot. And we had a long conversation about that. But I recalled to him, I can remember him in the late 80s or early 90s on the old Bill Maher show on Comedy Central, Politically Incorrect, where he was like, I am a super optimist because humans are the ultimate resource. And he talked about how like when we don't have tin cans anymore because tin got too expensive and they developed aluminum cans. And it's like, the New York Times in its moment was kind of great, or it could be, and then when it gets restrictive or repressive, it doesn't go away, but suddenly Substack or something else crops up. And there are these new places that fill up, these rooms that didn't exist. We're in heaven, and our master house has many mansions. And it's like, we're constantly opening up new rooms where you can do more stuff. And it's like really fucking awesome. And this is, I've been struggling to try and figure out how to describe to people, because I have this sense, and I don't know if it's like male menopause or something, but like you, I think there's going to be a kind of step change that we don't fully anticipate. We don't know what it's going to look like, but I remember talking to my parents who've been dead for years, but they were born in the 1920s, and they talked about the difference between 1945 and 1950. And these were, they grew up poor kids of immigrants in New York and at Waterbury, Connecticut. And, then they suffered through the Depression and World War II. My father was in World War II. He was wounded in World War II and all of this. And by 1950, they were like in a totally different world that was as unimaginable as the 20-year-old you living today, right? In a 5-year period where suddenly the big problem was that everybody was getting fat, whereas like their entire lives, they had been calorie restricted by brutal economics and whatnot and World War. And I feel like we're in that moment. And I like to talk about the long 20th century, which I would peg as maybe starting with like Bismarck in Germany and the creation of a kind of social welfare state, the idea that the government and corporations in concert with the government are going to give you everything you need. And kind of it's a top-down, regulated, restricted approach. We're still in the 20th century. I mean, that's why Republicans and Democrats, like, they have fewer adherents than ever. Fewer and fewer of us every year affiliate as Republican or Democrat, but they're still around. And we still have these lumbering organizations and mindsets that are just not speaking to how we live today. It's like when you go into an old house and you're like, what is this, front parlor and back parlor, et cetera. Like nobody lives like this anymore. But, we're aching to just kind of throw off this shell and move into, the next stage.
Yeah. And, two thoughts. The Human's the Ultimate Resource. You're familiar, of course, with Julian Simon.
Yeah.
His 2 books and his very famous bet where he let his opponent. Do you remember who the opponent was? Paul Ehrlich. Yeah.
Who had
Thank
written
you.
The population bomb.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so Simon's like, hey, Paul, you pick the resources. I'm going to give that advantage to you. I'm going to say 10 years from now, they're either going to be replaced or cheaper.
Right.
And Ehrlich was like, this is the easiest money I ever made. And of course, Ehrlich lost because human ingenuity is the ultimate resource, in my opinion. If you read David Deutsch's The Beginning of Infinity, which I think is a brilliant book at explaining why we're at the beginning of infinity, is the title of his book, because humans are the only universal explainers and connectors. And we also have the ability to think abstractly. If you can't think abstractly, you don't get quantum physics. You don't get, Bucky Fuller had a great thing where he said he preferred to look at people as tuned in or not tuned in. And the example that he gave, or maybe it was Robert Anton Wilson who was putting these words in his mouth, but the example was the microscopic world, right? So we didn't have microscopes, and so we were not tuned in to the microscopic world, right? We invent the microscope and we're like, holy shit, there's this whole world down there that tunes us in. But it takes, because of society and cultural lag and all of these types of things, it takes a while for the culture to assimilate that. I've always had this idea that, like, essentially there is ground state reality, and what ground state reality really is just what all of the alive sentient creatures occupying that planet kind of sort of agree on, right? And so one of my favorite lines is from Jed McKenna, the horribly named spiritual seeker, because if you read him, he's throwing bombs. He's not namasteing people, but essentially he has a little exchange with a fictitious student, and it's like, so wait a minute, what you're saying is that reality is a numbers game? And his response is, yeah. And so the respondent says, you mean the more people that believe it? And then his answer is, that's what makes it real.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is, we were talking about Bitcoin earlier. I've always looked at money as a technology, and that's why I was very open to this idea that Bitcoin, Ethereum, et cetera, we're just improving the technology.
Yeah.
And it's been a technology since people were carrying around, clamshells.
Right.
But the idea that there is a huge amount of stasis built into culture, and I don't know that that's a bad thing, right? Because what it does, I'm forgetting whose quote it was, but when a genius is born in the world, a confederacy of dunces unifies against him.
Yeah.
And like everything that's new, for the most part, like, people hate. Right. And like James Joyce, brilliant. I mean, the first postmodern writer. But at the time, everyone couldn't make head nor tails of this guy.
And I think this is, to my mind too, one of the, when we're in a great moment where it's emergent though, like geniuses, they're not dropped from the heavens. They emerge from a particular time and place and traditions. And so you're building off of things. And this is, again, toggling between big and small, but also between traditional and, kind of radical. That's, and in order to fully enjoy Joyce, and I have to say this as somebody who's of Irish American descent, I'm not a huge Joyce fan, but like in order to appreciate him, you not only have to be willing to go on the modernist ride, but you also need to know the classics. And
yes,
that's the best way to be, like where you are, you're constantly, toggling between tradition and radicalism, and improvement and things like that.
Exactly. And that's how Babel basically states that, yeah, of course we're going to fuck things up. I can't remember whose quote it is, but it was like, man invented fire and then noted that there were some problems with that. So they invented the fire extinguisher, the fire department, the fire alarm. But the point is that, like, people think people who are of an optimistic bent are like Pollyannish or Panglossian. And that's not true at all. In my opinion, we're creating new and better problems, right?
And I think the big problem in a lot of ways, and I say this as somebody, emerging from the mid 20th century, the high watermark of kind of a modern top-down regulated, best and brightest kind of approach. What we've done is we've made existential angst, which used to be reserved for very few people on the planet, people with means and people with, disposable income and leisure. We've we've made that a mass phenomenon, and that's an incredible triumph of economics and of technology and of political and cultural structures. But it does, this is, of late, I started out, in my kind of economic thinking related to libertarian stuff. I read a lot of Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek and people like Ludwig von Mises, and that more and more I'm drawn to Joseph Schumpeter, who's the guy who coined the term creative destruction. And he talked about in his masterwork, Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, which was published during World War II. He talked about how Marx was right that capitalism would destroy itself, but Marx was wrong about the reason. Marx thought that it would immiserate, everybody except for the 1%, effectively the capitalists, and then they would revolt. And he was like, no, actually what happens is that it throws off so much wealth that people take wealth production for granted and they like regulate it and they come to hate capitalism because it churns. The churn is too much. And we don't want to live with, the idea that you could be, living it up one day and then like within 5 years, your entire profession is gone because something new has come along that serves people's changing needs and desires better. And that's a rough ride. And in a lot of ways, I think we're and he thought he was witnessing that in the 30s and 40s. I think his timeline might be off. And like this, worries me again, this question of like libertarian ideas of individualism, of change, of synthesis and whatnot. Like there's a force against that. And part of it, both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump said this. Joe Biden embodies this of like, things were better 30 or 40 years ago. That, when Trump and Hillary were running in 2016, they were both kind of looking backward to the 70s when they were just starting their careers as like a golden age. Most people would be like, the 70s weren't so great necessarily, but politicians are backward looking. A lot of cultural kind of chieftains are backward looking. And that's part of what libertarianism, I think, needs to do, is to kind of give, these injections of optimism, of rational optimism, like this is how we got through it in the past. And we don't know what we're going to do to adapt in the future, but we know we've done it every other time and may come out better. So like, let's play those odds rather than saying we got to lock everything down because, too much change is too much for people to handle.
Yeah. So that's the precautionary principle run amok.
Right.
And that leads to stasis and death and no no meaningful change in society. And like, I'm a huge fan of Taoism, and one of the constant themes in Taoism is that movement is life, and that water is often used as one of their symbols, that it is the softest of entities, and yet it can destroy the hardest of rocks. And like, it's constantly repeated in Taoism is, the old and stiff die, the young and supple bend and snap back. And so it's sometimes maddening for me. I used to do a joke on Twitter, which was, I hate capitalism. He tweeted from his iPhone while at Starbucks.
Yeah.
Listen, there are parts of the market that I totally get are not great, right? And those get usually taken out if the market forces are allowed. Right. If they're not allowed, they perpetuate and they grow, and you get zombie companies like Japan after 1989. And you just watch
we're in like the fourth decade or something of the lost decade of Japan. And we're increasingly aping its, monetary, fiscal, and political policies in order to keep dead companies,
which is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
And like, so to understand things, you really have to be a system thinker, in my opinion. And like, I wrote an essay in 1984. I keep a lot of journals, and like, I was so enamored of the idea that everyone was going to have their own computer and that Big Brother could never get in there. I didn't envision that it would be in the cloud and that Big Brother could just turn it off or on. But I was like, we were all going to have our own hard drives, and so you couldn't take that fucking book off my computer.
Right.
But at the same time, like, there are the compete again. If you understand the system, there's a good book by a guy by the name of Howard Bloom called "The Genius of the Beast," in which he talks about capitalism as basically as a living organism system, and it's really a good book. It opened my eyes about a lot of things, about how there's the exploratory, but then there's the pulling back, right? Because let's not get crazy.
Yeah.
And it does a very, very good job. And one of the things that he says in there, and listen, this is coming from a guy with a degree in economics. What he says in there is that we're looking at the wrong thing when we assume rationality in human beings. And he goes, if you want to get to the core of like consumer demand, what you understand is desire, consumer desire. And he says that is an emotion. And if you don't understand that basically we are emotional creatures, our greatest emotion is fear of the unknown. And that drives many, many of us. But like, he's calling for a radical revamp in this book, The Genius of the Beast. Many of the proposals, which I think are really sensible. But when you think about it as a system, you immediately, if you're approaching it from a certain angle, understand that the market is a complex adaptive system.
Right.
And what are complex adaptive systems? They are systems that are impossible to control from the top down.
Right.
All of the change comes from the bottom. Yeah. All of the change in a complex adaptive system is emergent. Right. And so that's how we got all this.
You can screw things up for a certain period of time, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, for me, I think I came around to the idea of drug legalization earlier in my life than you did. And it's partly because I was not necessarily using drugs, but I was looking at the kind of cost benefit. And, when liquor prohibition, alcohol prohibition did work to reduce, the average intake of alcohol, but then the costs of that in terms of, creating organized crime, of imposing, people went from beer and wine to spirits, which were not sold in an open market. So, bootleggers, bad actors, were selling shitty booze that made people sick. When you don't have a ready access to something you want, you tend to, overdo it every chance you get. So there was cirrhosis. So it's not that alcohol prohibition didn't work to reduce the amount of alcohol consumed, for the period it was in place, but it created so many harms. Like anybody, including some of the architects of Prohibition, within a few years, they were like, wow, this is not working out the way it was. We wanted it to, so we should get rid of it. I mean, that's, it gives the illusion of control that, that while you can take this complex system, whether it's the economy or it's society or it's, capitalism, and we can regulate it and control it to our desired ends. And it's like, yeah, maybe for a while, but you're generally creating, more problems than you're fixing.
Yeah. Ceteris paribus is seldom true.
Right.
And, I just read Bill Bryson's One Summer, America, 1927. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. He spends a lot of time on Prohibition because I always use Prohibition as my poster child for why it's bad to do those things. And he maintains the book, at least, and this was news to me, that actually drinking went up substantially during Prohibition. It did not go down. And the idea was that something I'd never known was that the agency, the feds, right, who were the Prohibition enforcers, they actually put poison
right.
in whiskey bottles, not knowing who's going to drink that whiskey.
Right.
And so they literally murdered thousands of people.
There's a fantastic book called The War on Alcohol from Lisa McGeer, who's a Harvard historian, who looked at, one of the things is that there was no uniform prohibition because the feds did not have enough agents to really, control and regulate things. And so she looked at how in New York State, and thankfully a good Irish American, Al Smith, was running the joint. And he was like, fuck you, we're not enforcing any of this. If you want to enforce it, go ahead. And so like New York State, and particularly New York City, was pretty wet. But then in the South, the people who were pushing Prohibition, who were anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish, anti-immigrants, the dries that tended to be the old established WASP order, used it to crack down on immigrants and crack down on Black people, minorities, political, ethnic, racial minorities. And so that you had this very disparate kind of, impact of alcohol prohibition as well. It's an endlessly fascinating topic. And I think it's great to kind of illustrate some basic ideas that, like, if you believe in a free society, it's better to live in a world where you say, like, okay, you have a lot of choices and you're responsible for your choices. And, at the extreme ends, we're going to help people who are screwed up by bad choices. But, generally speaking, like, you create a world in which people know they have choices. You help them develop themselves so they can make good choices. And that works out better than saying, no, I don't like alcohol, so you're not going to drink, we're going to ban it. And then you can either drink it or not on the sly and whatever.
Totally agree. And you bring up, I concur also, on the use of power to terrorize marginalized groups like Catholics, like Irish, like Black people, like homosexuals. Mm-hmm. And like, I think one of the greatest things when you were listing all of the accomplishments earlier in the show, I mean, I think it's fabulous that there's so many people now can actually express themselves and don't express themselves without a fear of being like rounded up or worse, murdered. Yeah. And that's yet another one of these things that need to be really celebrated as far as I'm concerned. I don't care what color you are. I don't care who your sexual preference is. I just don't care about any of that stuff. And like, I just want to listen to your ideas. And the more that we can get, like, that's the other end that I think that younger people can be, you just approach it from that angle and you get somewhere faster. But you brought up immigration. Mm-hmm. And so this has been like one of my hobby horses for a long time. I am simply flabbergasted that, despite all of our problems, the smartest, most interesting and productive people in the world still want to live and work in the United States. Why the fuck are we not letting them?
No, it's awful. And, one of the unintended consequences of Donald Trump's presidency is that he pushed, according to Gallup and Pew, he pushed belief in the positive effect of immigration to historically high levels in America. And when he came down that escalator, basically the first thing he said is like, I'm not going to be politically correct. And then he went on to talk about Mexicans being rapists and disease carriers and drug mules. Mexico is not sending their best. And, he got people to say, you know what, like if the choice is between not immigrants or immigrants, like Americans historically at historically high levels will say they think immigration is good for the country. We don't have those policies. And this is also what's frustrating is that Trump was bad, and then obviously the COVID pandemic shut things down. Biden has not been very quick to open up the borders again. And in preparation for this conversation, you sent over some questions about, and one was, how would a libertarian go about solving the immigration problem in the United States? And the first thing I jotted down and considering that was like, we need to define it. And the problem is that we don't have enough immigrants. We don't have enough immigration. And I choke up thinking about this because all four of my grandparents were immigrants from old Europe, from, small villages in Ireland. That Ireland is the only country, as I understand it, that has in Europe that has fewer people than it had in 1800.
Yeah, true.
And then my mother's family was from Italy, from a small village in southern Italy. And these were people, they had no skills. They were barely educated. I mean, they may have been literate, to sign their name or something like that, but no education. And I have been to the places in Ireland that my grandparents are from. And it's like, and in Italy too, that for 1,000 years, the Gillespies and the Guidos were raised to be serfs and peasants. And they got to the US and within a couple of generations, like their kids are kind of masters of their own destiny, which is really fantastic. And if my grandparents could do it, anybody can. And we see this again and again. So defining the question, the problem with immigration isn't that we have too much immigration or that immigrants aren't assimilating. It's that we don't have enough immigration to this country. And I think this is one of the things where, if you understand like a systems approach, where it's a country is not a fixed entity that absorbs people and stays the same, but it is this system that is constantly growing and morphing and changing and advancing, so that it could, in the 19 teens and 20, or, certainly in the Great Migration from Europe from 1880 to 1920, Catholics were an existential threat to America, to the concept of America. It was a Protestant country. It was not a Judeo-Christian country. It wasn't a Christian country. It was a Protestant country. And we've done pretty well. We've assimilated Catholics pretty well to a point where you can't tell anything about anybody by knowing they're Catholic. You don't know their politics. You don't know their sexual orientation. You don't know their position on abortion even. And we need more immigration and we need more comfort with the idea that America is best when it is more open to new ideas and to, I don't want to say blood because that conjures up a kind of genetic determinism, but like to people with different experiences and different desires. The best Americans may not even live here. They're the people who want to be in charge of their lives and kind of create the world that they want to live in. And it kills me that we are stuck, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, like there's always this tendentiousness about immigration as if it isn't the thing that keeps a country young and vital and forward oriented.
Totally agree. And, I honestly, and I'm not just saying this for effect, I just don't understand how, I'll give you an example. This was what got me really going on this. I used to do a lot of traditional media, for O'Shaughnessy Asset Management. Yeah. And so in 1 week, I was on CNBC, Squawk Box, and with me, in the green room was Paul Ryan, the previous Speaker of the House. And I met him and I said, pleasure to meet you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask you a question? And he's like, sure. And I'm like, why isn't there a one-page bill that simply split like baby steps? Why don't we staple a green card or citizenship to every advanced degree that we grant from a U.S. institution to someone who wasn't born here. And he goes, I have that bill in my desk. Now, of course, probably lying to me.
Yeah.
But I'm like, well, how come you're not passing it?
Yeah.
And like, he's like, well, these things then went into political talk. And if you're a Claude Shannon fan, he says in information theory, information is actually new things that you learn. So he says there can be a ton of information in a poem. And he goes, there's zero information in a political speech. Anyway, so I was on Bloomberg Radio later that week. And who was I sharing the room with but Secretary Clinton? And I'd met her before. And so, Secretary Clinton, nice to see you again. I asked Paul Ryan last week, I just happened to run into him at CNBC. Why isn't there, same thing.
Yeah.
Why don't we stay? And she was like, oh, I'm totally in favor of that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wouldn't it be great if like the two of you could do a joint press conference?
And they would be joined by 75% of Americans.
Of the American people.
Because it's like when you start to go down the line and you say, immigrants consume fewer social welfare resources than native-born people, especially when you control for income and education level and things like that. The only, you get people start with the economic argument. They say, well, immigration is going to destroy, the American labor force, and it doesn't. So then they get to the cultural argument, where it's like, oh, well, you know what, then it creates too much confusion in society. And it's like, one of the best books about immigration is by an Indian scholar, Asian Indian, South Asian Indian, Chandran Kukathis, who's now teaching in Singapore. But he wrote a book recently, and it's called like Immigration and Assimilation or something like that. But
we'll find the title. We'll put it in the show notes.
He talks about how immigration, one of the other things, if you care about freedom, when you have extreme limitations on immigration, it limits the freedom of native-born people. Like, maybe we can start appealing to people's naked self-interest that, like, if you have, maximally filtered borders, it means you're not as free to do what you want in your own country. I agree with you. There is, there is an emotional component to immigration that people either are for it or against it. And that can vary for a lot of different reasons. I've had over the years, I've lived in, New York, Philadelphia, Buffalo, LA, a small town in Texas, small town in Ohio, DC, a bunch of other places. And one of the things that is stunning is when you are in parts of the country that don't have a lot of immigration, they tend to be anti-immigrant, and they also tend to have weak economies. So like that's, another thing. It's like, don't let people who are in places that don't want immigration, and immigrants aren't going to anyway, don't let them shit the bed for places that immigrants go and people are happy to have them. Even within the border of the, between Mexico and the US, the border towns aren't anti-immigrant. They have lower than average crime. What they want is, just a kind of, regularity of everyday life. And if everybody who's here is presumed to be legal, they can be verified and validated, and they can pay taxes and they can work. And you never go wrong by having more workers around.
Exactly. And, something like, I don't know if this is currently true, but historically true. Half of all Silicon Valley successful startups were founded by immigrants. And, it's one of those things where we have such an obvious advantage that we are squandering.
Yeah.
Despite all of the Sturm und Drang and high drama and people shouting at each other, like there are so many clever people who want to live and work here. I am at a loss trying to understand any of the arguments. Your point about the emotional side of immigration is well taken. I mean, that's why, again, the book, Bill's book, America 1927, I knew this, but I hadn't reflected on it in a while. We slammed the immigration window shut because of all of the anarchist bombings in America. Like people, especially young people, like, this is the most violent time in America ever. And I'm like, you kidding me, man? Like in the 1970s, like 5 bombs went off every week.
Yeah.
Around the country.
And there were hijackings,
Yeah. And so again, perspective, right? If you have some ability to gain perspective, then you get very, very bullish on these things. But I get it. They shut it was a travesty the way so-called justice worked, even in the early parts of the 20th century. But at least directionally, we were pointed in the right direction. But let's not try to obscure the fact that there were a lot of fucking horrible things that happened in this country.
Yeah.
But that's true of every country.
It's also, speaking of like your idea of just giving, certainly anybody who, I would say even, I think anybody who shows up here is, and if you're saying, okay, everybody can come here and live legally, you can actually have fast moving queues where you check people's identity. And okay, if you have violent crime or communicable disease, you're put to the side. But certainly people who graduate college or higher education, and, we have this influx, particularly of Chinese, Aravis, upwardly mobile Chinese people who are coming to the U.S. en masse for college, because our colleges, despite whatever problems they have, are really remarkable. And, why we aren't, all you have to do to sell America is like, hey, here's a work permit. You can live here as long as you want. You pay taxes and and instead we're like, hemming and hawing about like how many H-1B visas are allowed this year. And, and even, agricultural, workers and things like that. It's nuts. And I wish we, this is again, like for me, one of the advantages of being a small L libertarian is that you see a different set of continuities. And like, the continuity between Obama and Trump and Biden on immigration is disturbing. The rhetoric is different, but the reality is the same. And like, we should be opening up our borders, because this is also, it's good for economic growth, it's good for cultural growth, and it's also the right thing to do. I mean, how do we make America great again? It's like, maybe by opening up the borders, and I think about this a lot. Again, referencing our age, in 1970, that was the lowest census where percentage of foreign born in the country was below 5%. It's the lowest level. And it's like, the economy, during the Depression, nobody was going to be coming here anyway. And then World War II, Europe was rebuilding, et cetera. But it's like, it wasn't until 1965 that immigration laws opened up again. And suddenly we started getting a lot of people from Mexico or from Latin America, as well as Asia. And, in this, the late 60s and early 70s, when we had very few people coming here, it was not a good economic time. I mean, again, self-interest, like the more people you bring in, the more workers you create, the bigger the markets become. There's a lot of economic data, and I realize this doesn't get to that emotional thing. Low-wage American workers, Native American workers benefit from having low-skilled immigrants. They do a certain type of work, and it bumps up low-skilled native-born Americans. And, I think we need to be selling that more. If free trade is good, and I realize, free trade is a great libertarian argument that seemed to have been won decisively at the end of the 20th century. I think we need to revisit that now, because a lot of people are protectionists again. And again, this is continuity between Obama, Trump, and Biden. Buy America programs are bullshit. We need to revitalize that. But if you believe in free trade, you should also believe in free migration, because people are more important than goods and services. And we win when we allow more people into the country, I think.
No question. Well, this has been absolutely fascinating, as I thought it would be.
Can I extend this just for a second? Because I wanted to get to your, one of the questions. I love the things, and we kind of got to some of them and not to others. But you raised the question about social media. Is it causing increased tribal affinities and accentuating all the bad parts of the human OS, operating system? Or can it be fixed? Does Twitter get displaced by a decentralized system? And the answer to that last question is yes. And, Jack Dorsey, who I think is one of the most interesting kind of large company tech CEOs, both at
I agree.
Block and
I
formerly at Twitter. When he was at Twitter and he was doing it at Square, which is now Block, he's a big blockchain Bitcoin enthusiast. And I saw him a couple of years ago at the Bitcoin conference in Miami say, look, my dream for Twitter at the time was a completely decentralized version of it where there is no kill switch. There is no centralized anything. And that is emerging. I mean, in a lot of these peer-to-peer or end-to-end encryption apps, it's dispersed, it's decentralized. Even within Twitter, you referenced Robert Anton Wilson, who I think is one of the great, geniuses of the past 30 or 40 years. And his Illuminatus trilogy is a great, joke of a conspiracy novel. But, even within Twitter, and they ban people and this and that, but there's still a huge amount of freedom because it's such a loose and baggy monster. You can be doing lots of interesting stuff in a way that I think Robert Anton Wilson would appreciate. But, Twitter and other social media apps are going to be disaggregated in ways where, there's always going to be people on the frontier, and then those will become the main settlements, and then people will move on, kind of like you were talking about with ants and termites and all of this kind of stuff. But more to the point, what I wanted to say about social media more broadly, like we're in a very negative space about technology for a variety of reasons. And I wanted to make an analogy in the beginning of the cable era, like cable TV was restricted for decades. It was technologically feasible by the late 60s, but the National Association of Broadcasters had more political clout. So it didn't get rolled out really fully nationally until the late 80s and early 90s. And then you had at the time people blaming all the ills of the world on cable TV and, violence on cable, sex on cable. And it's like you look back on it and it's like, sex on cable was really like looking at encrypted Cinemax waving lines and seeing like a boob, on a show or something. Like there wasn't no sex or real violence on cable, but it was being blamed. And there were a bunch of people who were serious. They had, a lot of power within the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration, under Janet Reno, who was awful and was, a control freak. But they were saying, they pointed to how television was, when television was introduced, this was a serious argument. Television was introduced to South Africa in the mid 70s because South Africa realized we can set, and television is like a hierarchical, a diagrammatic top-down medium, right? Because it's like you have to have a big broadcasting tape and then it gets sent out to dumb receivers. Like it's not a lot of interactivity, right? And people were seriously saying, look, when television was introduced to South Africa in 1975, when they finally relented and allowed it, violence in South Africa picked up dramatically. As if you could blame the end of the apartheid regime on television. So like what I want to suggest to you about social media is that the new media or the dominant media, the rising media or the kind of incumbent media gets blamed for everything. And social media is not that bad. It's what it does is it enfranchises many more people. More people can speak with more freedom and more content, and get heard. Some of that's bad. Like I disagree with a lot of stuff, but I also, it's like, what a great world. Like we have a marketplace of ideas, and people like Jonathan Haidt, the social psychologist, who I consider a friend and a kind of fellow traveler in a lot of ways, is talking about social media is ushering in a new age of a Tower of Babel. And, we have to figure out a way to kind of restrict it or regulate it and regiment it. Like, no, we don't actually. What we need to do is recognize that we're in a moment where powerful people, powerful interests, and not always in a bad way, are unhappy with the way the world is going. And they are looking for things to blame. And you always blame the new media. You blamed rock and roll. You blamed the novel. You blamed movies. You blamed radio. You blamed, cheap theater in the early 1900s and things like that. And that's, I think, fundamentally what's going on with social media. Because what's great is Facebook is losing market share. Facebook in North America is a declining company. Facebook doesn't even call itself Facebook anymore. Twitter has been trying to grow its user base, its average daily user base for a decade and can't do it. People are moving elsewhere. is, which is bigger than Twitter, but nobody talks about it because it's all just young people. It's not old farts like us, who get worried about it, is stuck. So we're already gravitating into new, more dispersed, decentralized places where people can speak freely. And that is pretty good.
So the highest compliment that I can pay you is that I am going to steal every bit of that last bit.
Right.
You put that in such the right context. It's brilliant.
Thank you.
I had never I'm envious too, because
I didn't think of it until your question, the way that you, and
okay.
The idea of the human operating system, one of the things years ago in a review of 2 books about libertarianism, one by David Bose of the Cato Institute and one by Charles Murray, who after the bell curve, Charles Murray wrote a book called What It Means to Be a Libertarian. And it's like, right. Thanks, like, wow. Okay. But I talked about capitalism or libertarianism, and I think capitalism is the economic application of liberal ideas of giving people more freedom and more choice in their lives. But it's, what we want is an operating system that allows people to launch as many applications as possible without crashing the system. And those applications are kind of like John Stuart Mill experiments in living. And there are bounds on those because, people could act in a way where it just fucks everything up. And you have to, I'm not an anarchist,
right?
But, that's the idea of an operating system, like to use, we should be using the metaphors suggested by the technologies that are improving our lives. And I think that human operating system is a great metaphor that I'm going to be stealing.
Yeah. Well, I stole it from Brian Romelli. So but again, how great is that? How great is social media that I got to read Brian's work and have him on the podcast and everything and take the uniqueness of it and just ooh, I love that word, human operating system. That makes a ton of sense. And now I'm going to be taking the way you put them together just immediately as you were saying it. I'm like, of course they're always blaming what the new, I remember I was at School of Foreign Service at Georgetown and I lived off campus and it was 1980 or 81. And so there's a TV in the apartment I was living in. I turned it on and there was HBO. And I'm like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
And that's all I watched, right?
Yeah.
Because it had the most interesting stuff. It had none of the FCC oversight. I'm like, this is genius.
But HBO didn't even have commercials, right?
No,
so,
right.
Better.
It's incredible. But I remember the Gore's wife Tipper and her war against music.
Yeah. And against Dungeons and Dragons.
Right. Which, of course.
Yeah. She wrote a book called Raising PG Kids in an X-Rated World because she was disgusted when she heard one of her daughters listening to Prince's song, Darling Nikki. And then the PMRC, the Parents Music Resource Center, created a list of songs called the Filthy 15. And a bunch of them were occult songs because they were like, they believed in backward masking and that, Satanism and drug abuse were as dangerous. One of the songs on the Filthy 15 was a Cyndi Lauper song called She Bop, which is widely understood to be about masturbating. And it's like, social panics, moral panics, while you're going through them, they don't seem as ridiculous as they are later revealed to be. But I think a lot of what we're going through is a social panic, a moral panic over the fact that a lot of people can speak more freely. And to go back, I'm going to call up my kids after this and be like, you guys, I understand why you're nervous about speaking out sometimes, but you got to do it because that's all we got, right?
Yeah, it is.
And it's a better time to be speaking and listening, than ever before in human history, which until next year, I hope.
Yeah, right. And to cap that thought, it's like we now are in an environment where we can freely express a huge variety of ideas, some good, some bad, that they'll get shaken out of the system. You don't have the ability for them to just be no, you may not consider or talk about that at all. And I just look at that as, I find that so wonderful and so amazing. And the other thing that I also think about is, in the end, the new and better ideas won for the most part. They called the Impressionists as an insult.
Right.
That was the name the French Academy gave them. And they were like, it is like a child finger painting, right? They had who has the last laugh? Van Gogh couldn't sell a single painting. Greatest painter in the world.
You mentioned James Joyce and Ulysses. I mean, it's complicated both by, his literary estate, but by obscenity laws in the United States. It was really until the late 50s when it was easy to get U.S. editions of Ulysses and things like that. And a lot of other literature that is, totally unobjectionable. And that's a technology of living. It isn't, the printing press didn't change printing technology. It's like, we're like, okay, we're going to be a little more adult about this. We're going to be more libertarian and give people more choices rather than fewer choices. And, I think that's a better way to live. Thinking about things from, the real, it's not right or left, it's choice versus control. It's authoritarian versus libertarian. And come on, what side of that, chasm do you want to be on?
Exactly. Well, you know what side I want to be on. This has been awesome. At the end of all my podcasts, I ask my guest the same question, which is, I'm going to wave a wand. This is going to be a tough one for a libertarian because you're going to say, well, I don't want to make other people do anything that they don't want to do. But you are emperor briefly of the world for one day. Okay. You can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But what you can do is speak into a magical microphone and incept two ideas into the entire population. And whenever they wake up the next morning, wherever they are, when their next morning comes, they're going to wake up and think that both of these ideas were theirs, that they came up with them, and that they were going to start behaving or thinking or doing the two things that you're going to suggest.
Wow.
What do you got for me?
I wish I had thought about this. One of the things that I think I would want people to do is to transpose themselves into whatever subgroup in their village or their society is the most outcast. Really to gain that kind of empathy with the dispossessed, because I really feel part of the problem in the way that libertarianism has been sold in capitalism is that it is a system, and it's a pretty simple system, and it's an easy one to excel at. You don't have to be smart. You don't even have to be that hardworking. And if you're a little bit smart and you're very hardworking, you're going to do fantastic. But people don't know that there's a system, and understanding why people don't understand that, this is right in front of them. So I think that would be one of them. Live for a day in the world of the person that is considered the lowest in your society, and then the other is live for a minute or for a day, as the richest person in your society, and see, what doesn't change from your day-to-day life, because this is, I recently, and I don't think I'm 1%, but I'm doing extremely well, certainly better than I could have ever figured based on how I grew up and where I grew up and everything. And I recently went to France for a couple days, and it was like a jet set lifestyle, which I've really never done before. It's probably old hat for you, and it was kind of fantastic. But the thing that stayed with me on a certain level was that my life every day, my entire life has been kind of the same. I have more economic security, and I was able to pay for my kids' education and all of that, which is not a small thing at all. And it, and it was a choice. But, I recognize that I have so much freedom and so much kind of choice in my life that being much, much wealthier would not change that very much. And it kind of gives me a newfound appreciation for what life is like in a relatively free, open society, that is not only open culturally, but also open economically and whatnot.
I love both of those. On the first one, That's actually an idea that I've had. When VR gets better,
Yeah.
We'll be able to let people actually do that. And
Isn't that amazing? And I know there are some early experiments of training for police and other people, like to go through a simulation as, a minority group, or, and it doesn't have to be racial or ethnic or gender or sexual orientation. It could be any number of things.
Sure. Yeah. And then the second one I love too, because I have much the same thoughts as you expressed. And Darren, so 2 books that I think you'd really love. The first is an upcoming guest, Will Storr, who wrote his most recent book is The Status Game. And he explains, I think, really, really well how it's built into human OS. And that even though you think you're not playing, you are playing always. But that he ends it on such a positive note, such a thoughtful and hopeful note, that I think you'd love it. And then Darren Brown, the stage illusionist, who wrote a book on happiness, which I absolutely adored. As part of that book, he recounts, it wasn't his originally, it was another scholar's thought experiment. And essentially what it was, what happens if you wake up tomorrow and you're the only human left alive? Everything else is still there. So what are you going to do? And basically, when you think it through, I'm going to go live in the mansion. I'm going to go drive the Lambo. But then where he ends up is, you know what? You're going to pick a house that's easy for you to keep up. You're going to not care about clothes. You're not going to care about what kind of transport you have. You're probably going to prefer something like walking or a bicycle. And then he brings it really home, Brown does, that basically much of what we do is to signal other people. And that when we realize that, the much saner route is like, if you're the last one alive, man, you're going to go to the Library of Congress and just start reading books. Or if Google's still up, you're just going to learn about things, but you're not going to care about all those superficial things. So I think you're bang on about the, I mean, having more money in certain regards than less. I think once you get to the Maslow part of the hierarchy where you can start working on, your internal things, that's great. Yeah. But it's also fraught, right? You mentioned existentialism, and that's what I call the bridge of nihilism. And what you've got to understand, in my opinion, is you got to walk across the bridge of nihilism. And when you get to the other side, you realize if nothing matters and there is no reason for our being here, well, guess what? You get to create your own reason and you get to create your own purpose. And, man, that allows you to live in color as opposed to black and white. Yeah. So this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for doing this.
Really appreciate it.